All right, welcome everybody. My name is Brandon Crumsey and I am the UGA Extension Clayton County Agriculture Agent. And tonight we are talking worm composting. So the title of this is Weed Trash Composting with Worms. So essentially, if you're doing worm composting, that's pretty much exactly what the worms are doing. They are, eating our what we call trash, our food waste, and they're turning it into compost. So I gotta have a couple questions for you all. So how many of you currently compost right now? And you can unmute yourselves, or you can type it in the chat if you want. So no one composts currently? We're all new, you're all new to this? All right, and yes, all right, we got a couple people, so a couple people compost. And then what do you all use your compost for? All right, you put it in your garden. All right, cool. All right, so we have a couple people who have some composting experience. So the I guess the fun part of worm composting is it's very easy, very enjoyable. Pretty much anyone can do it. So let's get into it and let's start talking and see how we can do this. So what is compost? So a lot of times when we go in the garden store, right, you'll when you're looking for soil bags and things like that, you'll be able to see compost bags. So all compost is it's just a finished product of decomposing organic matter. And compost usually comes from different things like food waste. It can come from broken down trees, decomposing leaves, things like that. So a bunch of different organic matter comes together, and when it's broken down, compost is the finished product. And it's often this dark brown, black, rich color here, and it'll smell really earthy. So this is what we're trying to accomplish with the composting process in general, especially with worm composting, but it's just slightly different than regular composting. So worm composting, like regular composting, is all about the decomposition process. So with non-worm composting, you're mainly depending on a lot of the microorganisms or really small bacteria and things like that in the compost to break all that stuff down. So with worm composting, our main workers are our worms that we use. And, you can easily see worms with the naked eye, and they're doing all the heavy lifting for us so that we can get this finished product called compost, so we can use it in our gardens and our vegetable beds and things like that. So in composting in general, so you have two groups of decomposers. So the first group is the chemical decomposers. These are the ones I just talked about. So these are the ones that you generally can't see. So these are things like fungus, bacteria, and a real good picture I have is this one of this lemon right here. So if you compost citrus fruits in your regular compost bin, you'll definitely see this type of fungus on there. It's very common. So in vermicomposting, the second group would be our physical decomposers. So in this case, that would be our earthworms. So all vermicomposting is basically composting using worms. And vermi refers to vermiculture, which is referring to worms. So worms essentially help us decompose all this stuff we're putting in there. And they basically have a bowel movement and push it out. And that excrement is what we call the vermicompost. So what type of worms should you use for this? So the main type of worms you should use are called red wigglers. So I know in your yard, you've probably seen earthworms before. Those could possibly be red wigglers, but you don't know for sure. But red wigglers are the best worm to use for worm composting. So why the red wigglers or the red worms? So they are pretty much just love the temperatures of worm composting bins. So these worm bins, they're usually about 60 to 80 degrees roughly. So they like those warmer temperatures. They like the overall environment of the worm bin. It's dark, it's moist, it's warm. And then how many worms do you need? So roughly 1 pound of worms is gonna break down a half a pound of garbage. So that's the rough measurement that you can use. And these red wiggler worms are very common and easy to get. So you can look online and there's a ton of different people who sell red wigglers. So you can just have them shipped to your house. You know, if you don't want to go anywhere, you don't want to try to find them. I don't know if we have any local worm farms in our area in Clayton, but you probably have some in the metro area, I would think. So you can probably just pick up some worms from someone who has a worm farm, or if you already know someone who does worm composting, they'll be able to give you some worms. But the easiest place for you to just drive and go is a bait shop. And we have a couple local bait shops in Clayton. And then Academy Sports sells them. Bass Pro probably sells them. So any place that sells fishing equipment or fishing tools and baits and things like that, most likely they're going to have red wiggler worms, and they're only, you know, a few dollars for, you know, a large cup of them. So they're really easy to get, really cheap to get. So worm castings, this is what we're really aiming for when doing vermicomposting. So all these pellets you see here on the screen, these are worm castings. So those are what the worms end up excreting from their bodies once they digest that waste. It goes to the digestive system, they break it down, and then they push it out of their bodies. And that's called worm casting. So it's essentially worm poop. But worm poop is very rich in a lot of different nutrients. So that's our vermicompost. And if you look closely in this red circle here, you'll see these yellowish white circles. So those are actually worm eggs. So when you have your worm bin, you start seeing these, and that's a really good sign, because that means the worms are reproducing, and they reproduce very quickly. So that means the conditions of your worm bin are pretty good, pretty ideal for them as well. And then also, in addition to purchasing compost, you can purchase worm castings as well. And you can find these online, but it looks just like compost, but it's a very rich substance. So essentially, again, this is worm poop. So it has a lot of different nutrients in it. And then why should we even compost in the first place? So two main reasons. So the first reason is, like a couple people said earlier when I asked did they compost. So you can, once you break down your food waste, you use worms to create compost. You can use compost in your garden, right? You can use it on your flowers. You can use it in your vegetable garden. You can use it on your lawn. So it's a really cheap, valuable substance that you can produce at home that can help improve the health of your plants, right? Then the second good reason is helping to divert the trash that's going to the landfill by actually composting it. So about 30% of the waste that we produce in our homes and send to the landfill can actually be composted. So think about, how many, millions of pounds of trash every year that go into the landfill that could have been composted and broken down and then, used in a garden, used on a lawn, used on some vegetables. So good for the environment in two major big ways. And then, with worm composting, the added benefit to this is, if you like to go fishing, if you're an avid fisherman, fisherwoman, you have a constant supply of, free bait basically. So you're using the worms to create compost for your garden. And then if you want to go on a fishing trip, you just go in your worm bin, grab a handful of worms, and there you go. You got plenty of bait for another fishing activity that you can go to. So this is a picture of what a kind of small scale worm bin looks like. So one of the easiest things that you can get to make a worm bin are these those plastic storage containers that you can find, you know, at the hardware store, at your general store, because they're easy to carry around. They're cheap. You can drill holes in them. Real easy to create a nice worm bin environment for your worms. And I actually have a bunch of these containers. Well, I think I have about 15 or so of these containers. So if anyone's interested in picking up one of these containers from my office, you know, you can just send me an email and I'll put my email in the chat, and, you know, you can come by and just pick it up for free, start your worm bin. So how do you make a worm bin? So as far as what you're gonna need, worm bins can vary depending on what you build them with. So in this picture here, this is a wooden worm bin. So the materials for this are obviously going to be a lot more expensive than, you know, if you're buying a plastic storage bin. So the materials are going to be more expensive. With this, you're going to need to have drainage holes at the bottom, so you can, so, you know, when that moisture builds up, that water has someplace to go. And that's why you see those pans at the bottom. That's called vermicompost tea, and we'll talk about that later. And then with wood, you also have a lower odor. Generally not gonna have as many moisture problems. This is definitely gonna be very heavy if you wanna move it around your yard or move it into a garage. And, you know, if you wanted to paint it to make it look a little fancier, you can definitely do that. So wooden bin is one way you can start your worm bin. And then this is a kind of a commercial worm bin that you can buy, you know, online. So the idea is that the worms easily move up through this worm bin as you're adding food. And then it has a little spigot at the bottom where you can drain out the worm compost tea. So this is a video of how this worm bin works, is worm tower. So, you know, again, your first option, you could build one out of wood. Second option, you can also buy a worm bin, and I'll show you a video of how this works right here.
Go.
Hi, it's Janet here from Green Urban Living, and today I'd like to show you how to harvest your worm castings from your worm farm. Now this worm farm has been up and running for about 8 months, and so it's got the 3 layers being processed. This is the first layer that I put on, this one here, and then once that was full, I started with the second layer, started feeding the worms into there. Most of the worms moved up into the middle layer, and then when that was full, I put on the last tray, started feeding the worms from there, so a lot of the worms are up into this one. So now I'm ready to harvest the worm castings from this lowest tray. So it's quite a simple process. Basically what I do is I mix around the trays. So the top tray comes off, and the middle tray comes off, and if you look into the bottom tray here, you can see that this one is quite finely processed. It's quite difficult to see you know, what sort of food was in here. There's chances that you always find a piece of Lego though, or a chocolate plastic wrapping. This is the middle one here, which is not as old. So most of the worms are still in this one and this one. So as you can see, you can still sort of see what sort of food has been given to the worms. As I said, here's a chocolate wrapping. And then this is the youngest tray. So this still has the dust from the vacuum cleaner bags, a bit of old Hessian sacking, and there'll be lots of food scraps and things like that. So most of the worms are in here processing all that fresh food. But now I'm ready to put this lovely worm castings onto my garden. So this is what I do. I take off the oldest tray, put the middle tray on the bottom, and then the tray with the freshest food in it goes onto the middle. And then what was the third tray is now on the top. And the worms don't like sunlight. So the secret is they will try and get away from that sunlight. So they will dive down and move into the third or the middle tray. And so I'll leave it like this for around 48 hours. And in that time, whenever I'm walking by, I'll just go like this, and that just moves all the soil around, all the worm castings around, so it drives any stragglers down into the middle tray. And after about 2 days, this is ready to harvest. And so I will put this around any vegetable seedlings that I'm planting. Pot plants love it as a mulch, or you can just put it into your general garden, or you can put a good sort of couple of handfuls of it into your compost tea, which is really good to use as a soluble fertiliser on your garden. So there you have it, a very simple way to harvest your worm castings.
Yep, so that's another route you can take if you want to start a worm bin or purchase a worm bin. And then, the plastic version I was talking about. So this is probably going to be the cheapest way. So it's cheap, it's easy. As far as drainage goes, all you would do is drill holes at the bottom of this, and then drill some at the top for some aeration to help with the drainage and the odors. And you can usually use these indoors, like in a garage or inside your home as well. And then you can also easily stack these. So the main advantage of having stackable bins is that this second bin can act as a lot more or extra space for more drainage, or you can use it like we just saw in that video as a follow the food system, where you can help the worms migrate into new areas so you can more easily harvest the compost. So this is generally how you would start a worm bin. So if you want to start your bed, you want to start out with some moist bedding. So here we have some shredded newspaper. So what you would do is you get some old newspaper, or you can even use some cardboard if you have that laying around, and you put it, tear it up or cut it up in different shreds. You can put it in a bucket to make it wet, and then wring it out. So now that your bedding is moist, and then you start out your worm bin with this foundation of bedding. So this is going to give your worms something to eat, and it's also going to help create a good environment for them to reproduce as well. So once you add your bedding, which is going to be your newspaper, your cardboard, you want to add some cover. So with this, I would like to use, you can use some finished compost, you can use some garden soil to help cover it up. So that's also going to help with the environment. That's also going to help with when you add food waste in there, that's going to also help control odors as well. So once you put the bedding in there, your newspaper, your cardboard, you add in some garden soil, some compost, you add in your worms, then you add in some food. That'll create the perfect environment for your worms. So as far as feeding your worms, so you want to do it gradually when you're starting out. So you want to start out small. So recommended amount is about ½ a pound of food scraps per pound of worms. So, you know, if you went to your bait shop, you got your pound of worms, you know, throw in about ½ a pound of food scraps in there, and you want to bury it into the bin. So you don't want to necessarily just leave everything on the top, but you want to bury it in the bin, because the worms like dark, moist environments. They don't like sunlight. So it's going to be perfect for them. And then it also is going to help control odors as well. And then as you're adding food, you want to rotate the spots you add food, so you make sure that there's an even distribution of that food as well. And then one technique is called surface feeding. So this will help you with moving your worms throughout your bin. So if you have like that stack system, for example, if you want your worms to move up from the bottom of the composting bin, you can just layer food on the surface to make them come up to that food out of the lower layer. So it doesn't have to, of course, look this neat, but this is just one technique that you can use. So then what exactly do you put in your worm bin? So you have pretty much two categories. So I call it the use it or the lose it category. So first one is use it. So in general, when you're working with worms, the things you can use are going to be mainly it's going to be fruit and vegetable scraps and then newspaper. But you can also add some eggshells in there, some coffee grounds, things like pasta or bread. But mainly worms really love fruits and vegetables. So especially fruits like watermelon that have a high water content, they love those. You know, bananas, melons, things like that. And then things you do not want to put in your worm bin include your meats. You know, I have a picture of fried chicken here, any dairy products, cheeses, yogurts, any greasy products like peanut butter, another dairy product like anything with a bunch of butter in it. And definitely no human waste, definitely no animal waste. And then worms aren't really fond of things like onions and garlic and then citrus fruit as well. So these are just two slides to help you kind of remember what to add in your worm bin. But in general, you're mainly going to be using fruit and vegetable scraps. So now that we know what compost is, we know how to make our worm bins, we know a little bit of the background. So of course, you know, like with anything, you're going to have some troubleshooting time where you're going to run into some different problems. So one of the most common things are people, you know, you might run into, you start noticing your worms are dying, right? So there's three main reasons why your worms will be dying. So first one is you have too much food in there. So if you have too much food in there, you want to kind of dial back how much food you're adding until the worm population catches up to that point to where they can more quickly break it down. It may be too wet in your worm bin because, you know, you don't, worms like a moist environment, but you don't want to drown them in water either. So you don't want it to be too wet. And then also you definitely don't want it to be too dry because they have very sensitive skin and it needs to be moist around them. So you want to make sure it's not too dry. And of course you can just add a bit of water to your worm bin or add some more wet bedding. And then ants. So this can be a really big problem, especially if you have worm bins outside in your yard. So, you know, worms, they're gonna love all the food scraps in there, but so are these opportunistic ants. So in general, with ant control, they don't necessarily like really wet conditions or moist conditions. So making sure you're keeping the bin moist. And then to keep ants out, you can use a couple of tactics on your worms. You can put, you know, some type of sticky substance at the legs of the worm bin to keep them from crawling into the bin, or you can put the legs of that bin in water to you know, prevent them from being able to latch onto that bin. And then flies. So you're thinking, you know, with compost, you know, you have a bunch of rotting stuff, you know, rotting food. Of course, flies would be attracted. Yes, but flies shouldn't be a problem because if you have a large fly problem there, that means there's a lot of exposed food. So the, you know, simple quick fix for this is basically make sure whenever you're adding food into your bin that it's covered up well. So cover food completely, don't just leave it exposed. Then of course you can just add some more bedding, add some more newspaper, you can add some more finished compost. You can make sure you cover up the food with those things, and then flies shouldn't be a problem. And then it smells. So yeah, again, you know, you have a bunch of rotting stuff in there, but it shouldn't, you know, you shouldn't be able to walk outside your house and then as soon as you do, you smell your worm bin, right? So if it smells, that means there's too much moisture in the bin. So you want to make sure you have those drainage holes in there. You want to add some additional holes for aeration. Or you might want to, there may not be, you know, again, enough oxygen. So that's where your aeration holes come in. Or you may have just, you know, added too much food and the worms can't keep up with how much food you're putting in there yet. So keep that in mind. So once you're finally done with troubleshooting, you're going to want to harvest it, right? And you're going to want to reap what you've sown in labor for sure, right? So as far as harvesting, there's a few different methods you can use. So this is called the dump and sort method. So this is probably the most tedious one. So the idea with this is you take scoops of your vermicompost and you can put it on newspaper or cardboard. You can put it on a table, and then you make mounds of it, like triangular mounds of the compost. And the idea is the worms are going to move to the bottom of that mound because they're trying to get away from the light. And then you just harvest the top of those mounds. So that's the dump and sort method, but probably the most time consuming. Then you got your one-sided method. So this is a lot easier. So in this scenario, you can see that this person has the plastic storage bin. So all you're doing is basically you want to start adding all your fresh food scraps to one side of the bin. And then what that's going to do, that's going to cause all the worms to move to one side of the bin because that's where the fresh food is. So it's like herding worms pretty much. So you're causing them to move to one area, and then the side that they move from, you can just scoop that part out to use for the finished compost, and you can continue to use this method. So this is probably the easiest method. And then you have the bottom scoop method. So you can use pretty much the kind of the one-sided method here. So you can start putting all the fresh food scraps at the very top of the bin temporarily and give the worms time to move up to the surface. And then you can start scooping out the bottom because you've caused all those worms to move up through the bin. So that bottom part should be pretty clear worms. So now that you've harvested your worm compost, how exactly can you use it? So you can use it just like regular compost. So you can use it as a slow release fertilizer. It does have a lot of nutrients in it, but not, it's not going to have as much as commercial fertilizer, but can be used as a slow release fertilizer on your lawn, in your vegetable garden, on your flowers. And definitely as a soil amendment for different gardening projects. And you can use it in potting soil. And I believe the potting soil measurement is you don't want to use more than about 25% of the mixture because too much of that compost is going to retain too much moisture for those young plants. And then compost tea is basically the runoff from the compost. So the compost tea is also a good fertilizer alternative because it contains all those nutrients and it's good for plant health. So the easiest way to make it is you can just get a 5-gallon bucket, put a few scoops through some type of filter material, as you can see in this picture, and run water over it. And that runoff is going to be your compost tea. So it's like the sweet tea of nature pretty much. So you can use that to water your plants as well. And then this is just a quick video that kind of illustrates the process a little better so you can see what all is going on in your worm bin.
Think of all the food made in the world each year. Hard to picture? Then imagine that you are all of humanity, and on a plate in front of you is the one lovely annual meal you make for yourself. You did all sorts of work putting that meal on your table. You must be eager to consume the fruits of your labor, and the vegetables and meats and waffles of your labor too, right? Well, oddly enough, a third of that meal ends up in the trash. A third of the food we eat globally. An estimated 1.3 billion tons ends up as waste. All the work we put into producing that food is wasted. And what's worse, it costs us. America alone spends an estimated $165 billion a year managing food waste. We're wasting food, energy, and money. Perhaps worst of all, we're wasting the chance to change, to make the system of food consumption more efficient. If you want to bring on that change, you should know about a humble yet diligent and ever so crucial ally, the worm. Worms convert organic waste and other compostable products into natural fertilizers. Up to 75% of what we put in the waste stream can become food and bedding material for vermicomposting. You can create a worm bin in your own home to see the composting process in action. First off, you need worms, and not your typical earthworms. You need red worms, Eisenia foetida, the species responsible for most vermicomposting in North America. These red wigglers are surface dwellers who don't burrow too deep. They're optimal feeders around room temperature, and they're well suited to converting organic waste into usable fertilizer. Now, your worms might be vermin, but they need a comfortable space to live and work. Some bedding material, either shredded paper or cardboard, some moisture, and of course, food. Namely, your leftovers, slightly decomposed table scraps. The worms break down food waste and other organic matter into castings, a fancy synonym for worm poop. Their excrement is absolutely teeming with microbes, which continue the decomposition process, making all those once wasted nutrients available again as fertilizer. The timeline for the whole process varies depending on the quantity of worms, the temperature, and how much waste is added to the bin. And there's another timeline to consider. In a healthy worm bin habitat, worm reproduction will occur when the wigglers become sexually mature, indicated by an elongation of the segments into a bulbous structure. 3-month-old wigglers can produce 2 to 3 semi-translucent yellow worm cocoons a week. You thought only moths and butterflies come out of cocoons? Well, we can't all be majestic. It takes around 11 weeks for new babies to hatch. When your bin seems to be full of living vermicelli noodles, it's time to share the bounty with your friends and start a vermicompost club. Or keep those worms to yourself and start a business. Vermicomposting isn't confined only to small worm bins. It's an emerging entrepreneurial enterprise. Large-scale facilities convert bulk organic waste and even manure into rich black castings called black gold. Its value as a soil additive is unparalleled, and it can help plants resist harmful pathogens. The lack of available land in urban environments, coupled with growing interest in smaller-scale farming, means there's a market for vermicomposting. Many communities use composting as part of zero-waste strategies, and they can sell their worm-eaten table scraps to local farms hungry for rich fertilizer. So instead of wasting money dumping wasted food in landfills, we can remake waste into an asset, putting it back into our food system to make it more sustainable. All with the help of the humble worm, the tiny organism that can help us change the way we look at food's place in our lives, and our place in the world, as long as we give the little guy a place at our table. Well, not an actual seat at the table. A bin in the shed is fine.
All right, so that is worm composting. So if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat or unmute yourselves. But I also have a quick poll for you all. If you could just answer these few questions for me. And once you complete the poll and you don't have any questions, just want to thank you for tuning in. And my email is displayed on the screen if you have any future questions as well. All right, thanks for attending, Ben. Yeah, so Francis asked, will the worms die over winter? So yes, if you keep your worms outside in the cold, especially when it's freezing, that can kill them. So in the wintertime, if you keep your worms outside, you want to move them inside, either to, a basement or a garage to protect them from the weather. All right. Well, if we don't have any more questions, hope you all go out and start your worm bins. Oh, all right. So Marianne says, what is the temperature that is safe for the worms, summer, winter? In the summertime, obviously in the summertime, in the south we have, high temperatures. So if you're keeping your worms outside in the summer, you want to keep them in a shaded area to keep them from getting too hot, because just like they can, freeze, they can also get too warm as well. So in the summertime, as long as you keep them in a shaded area and, you keep the bin stocked with food and it's moist, they'll be fine. And then in the wintertime, you want to bring them inside, either to, a garage or a basement, or if you want to keep them in your house to help keep the bin warm enough. Because the bin needs to be between 50 to 70 degrees, roughly. So that's what you should do as far as temperature control. Thank you. Thanks for attending. All right. Well, if we don't have any more questions, thank you all for joining in. Make sure you sign up for the Planting Flowering Bulbs class next month on Eventbrite. And if you have any more questions, feel free to email me. Thanks.